Welcome to the transport seminar that hosted by McGill. It's an honor and a pleasure to have Professor David Banister to kick off our seminar series. And if Professor Banister is an Emeritus Professor of Transport Studies at the School of Geography and Environment and the Transport Studies at Oxford, and he is a fellow at St. Anne's College. And I would say at a personal level, he would be the one that if you're talking about transport equity, he is the one that you have to read his book first. And the book is as good as one of my students had to send it to her parents to read after she took it in my classes. So he's gonna talk to us about his book. And please note that we are recording the session and we'll be taking notes and questions on the chat. So if you have any questions, please type them on the chat, and myself and Jamie will be asking Professor Banister these questions at the end. So please type in the questions in the chat. Thank you so much, and Professor Banister.
Thank you. And as I was saying a little bit earlier, that it's a really strange experience giving a talk to, as it were, an invisible audience. But let's see how it goes. The Inequality in Transport book is my latest book, I suppose. It's my 25th book. And I think it's my best book. When people ask me about this, I always say my latest book is my best book, because I feel that it is something different to say, and I feel that it's taken me longer to write it than most of my other books. And it's only when I retired that I really felt that I had the time and energy to commit to it. And the second way in which it differs is that it's the first book I've self-published. This is not because people didn't want it. There are 4 publishers who were interested in it, but I felt that I would like to do it myself and produce something which I was really pleased with in terms of layout, in terms of graphics, in terms of color, and hopefully in terms of quality of content. But what I want to talk to you about is the issue of inequality, and to ask the question, is it really important? Is it something that transport researchers and others should be spending a lot of time looking at? More generally within the economy, it reflects issues such as fairness and justice. But what we are actually finding in many different aspects of life is that there is a greater concentration of wealth and income. And this is particularly, or it's been particularly true in the more recent past, since about 1980s. In many of the more affluent societies, but also in lower income societies as well. And there has been quite an important sort of development recently, which is suggesting that the middle class are not actually bridging the gap between their expectations, their aspirations, and what is happening. Relatively speaking, they're becoming poorer when one compares their situation with those in higher income categories. And this isn't just about income, it's also about the whole nature of society. And we know about the problems that fragmentation can bring, that different aspects of instability, and this in a sense can be linked back to issues relating to equity and inequality. So that may be true more generally. But is this something that the same sorts of arguments, do they apply within our sort of remit? And what we can say here is that all society needs, and all people need, means to get around, to be able to get around and to access everyday opportunities. But equally, it is recognized that not everybody has the same set of requirements. And even the same groups of people or same individuals, their requirements change over time and space and through their life, throughout the whole of their life. So it's not a fixed thing, it's something that is very flexible, very malleable, and something which changes. So we would accept, or I would accept, that there are inequalities in transport, but what we're interested in is examining the scale, the nature of it, and how they impact upon people carrying out everyday activities, on their quality of life more generally, and on society as a whole. And related to that, in terms of planning and policy making, is looking at whether decisions that are made are fair, who are the main beneficiaries for investment and subsidy in transport, and as many people would argue that inequalities are or are not being addressed. And this, I think, is much more evident within the transport sector than within other sectors. But having said that, the book itself is divided into 4 parts. The first part is more of a historical and a theoretical perspective about what people have been saying about inequality in the recent and to some extent the more distant past. Secondly, there's quite a large empirical part, that what is the evidence on transport inequality? That's really the travel patterns, what people actually do. And then the bit, I think, which is really interesting to me is looking at this much wider perspective based in notions of well-being and mobility, and how this can be related more explicitly to social justice. And also there are other related issues that are important. The time issue I've mentioned, issues relating to sustainability, and also intergenerational issues that relate to, are the main beneficiaries today, or will they be there in the future as well? And finally, there's a section which looks at ways in which policy and planning that can actually address this. So what I want to do in this presentation is to talk about the second part, a bit about the evidence, a bit about the wider perspective, and then to focus finally on the future. And hopefully that there will be things of interest in it to all of you. I would preface my comments with the fact that most of the empirical evidence is taken from the UK, from our National Travel Survey, over a 10-year period from 2002 until 2012. This is because I'm familiar with the situation, but also the database has about 4 million trips in it, and it has information on people's income, which is part of the underlying rationale behind the book. What we find is that, as one might expect, society is much more mobile, something of the order 5 or 6 times increase in the distance per travel per person per day. And this, as we well know, reflects affordability, availability, the way in which lifestyles are organized, the fact that supply chains are much more global rather than local. So this is to be expected, that things are traveling much further, people, goods, and everything else, than they were in the past. But we also recognize that the costs are arising, not just the financial costs, the economic costs, but also the social and environmental costs, things like crashes, safety, congestion costs, security issues, severance, pollution. I've listed some here, and the climate change, amenity, open space, health dimensions as well. So although there are considerable benefits, there are also costs, and I'm interested in finding out a little bit about what these are and the scale of inequality between different groups within society. But I think underlying my thinking on this is that there are 2 basic approaches. There are others which I'll mention later as to some positions slightly in between the 2. One is a libertarian view that favors the rights of individuals over those of society as a whole. And this could be argued has led to more the dominance of the car. And in opposition to that is a Rawlsian perspective, in terms that the rich have gained new freedoms, but not just new freedoms. These have been gained at the expense of the poorer members within society. So there's one which is promoting a more individualistic approach to looking at justice and rights, and the other is suggesting that there's a much more distributional dimension to it, in terms of the benefits have not gone equally across society. It's gone more to those that are rich, and this has also affected adversely those that are less well off. So if we look at what's the situation in the UK over this period, and it's in Great Britain rather, GB, not in Northern Ireland, and this table has a lot of data on it. It compares the lowest income ventile, that's the lowest 5% of the population on the left-hand column, with the highest ventile here, which is the top 5%. And if we look at different forms of travel, and in the study we look at trips, we look at distance, and we look at time, what we've done here is just a simple ratio of the numbers of trips, car travel each year by the different income groups, and the factor in this final column is the ratio of one over the other. So we find that the richest make 2.75 times as many trips. They travel 4.8 times as further, and that's with car travel. With taxis and minicabs, there is some similarity. The poor make use of this form of transport as well as the rich. The people in between make less use. The ratio there is quite close. If we look further down at the walking trips, we find the poorest groups walk more than the richer groups, the ratio there being about 3 to 2. Cycling trips, not much difference between the lower end and the higher end. And then lower down, the bus trips, we find here a large difference, with the poorest group making up over 100 trips a year, 31 trips in the highest income groups. Rail trips is the situation in reverse almost, with a low number of trips by the poorest within society and 50 trips a year. And if we look at the distance, the difference is even greater. London Underground, again, quite a difference between those in the lowest income groups and those in the highest income groups. So whether we're looking at it by trips or by distance, certainly, there is a pattern that emerges. And what we find, I think, in summary, is that for the poorest within society, walking seems to be the most equitable form of transport, whether we look at travel, whether we look at trips, distance, or travel time. They also make a much greater use of the bus, whether we're looking at trips or by distance. With the rich and the poor, there are similar patterns for taxi trips and for car passenger trips. But the rich travel much further as car passengers than the poor do. With cycling, there's a small income effect, minor for some trips, or when distance is considered, again, the rich travel twice as far. And the same is true for taxi. And then for the other modes, for car drivers, car passengers, rail, and other forms of transport, inland aviation and various forms of coaches and that sort of thing, it's the rich that dominate, whether it's for trips, for distance, for travel time. And we put the ratios here, 2 times to 4 times, 4 times to 6 times. With travel time, the differences are much less. The rich spend more time traveling for work and for non-work related activities, but some of these differences aren't so clear. So I think the conclusion I came to here was that the extent of the differences are much greater than I expected. Maybe your experiences are different, and I'd be interested to hear those. It's the top 10% or the top 5%. It's the same, similar whether we take deciles or ventiles, consume more of everything, whether it's trips, whether it's the mode of transport, or whether it's the distance travel. And I want to illustrate this with looking at rail and looking at aviation, because I think this illustrates the differences in a series of slightly different sorts of ways. When I looked at the slide this morning, it says long distance over 80 kilometers. Well, in the UK, that might be true, but certainly in Canada and maybe some of these other countries, 80 kilometers is a relatively short distance. But in the UK, it accounts for about 2% of trips, not many trips, but about 30% of distance travel. And this is an interesting point in itself, I think, is that much of research in travel is looking at the urban problem, yet much of the long distance travel is where growth is taking place and where energy and other disbenefits are also more apparent, whether it's environmental related or other forms of costs. And in the UK, about half the population, this is about 20 years ago, made more than one rail trip a year. But this figure has now increased. And on the UK rail system, we now have, until very recently, obviously, record numbers of people traveling on the rail system. So that's positive. And about half of these are regular users, mainly journey to work. Many are of working age. They tend to be higher income levels. And there's a heavy concentration in the greater London commuting area into London, which is the main sort of focus for the rail network. But what I wanted just to illustrate here is that when we talk about longer distance or high-speed rail, particularly within the UK, where it's quite limited, and if we compare that with France, where they have a more comprehensive network of high-speed rail, it is the top 20% that make about 2/3 of all long-distance high-speed rail journeys. In France, it's slightly less. 40% have come from the top 20 groups. And if we look at some simple ratios, we find this sort of pattern emerging. So in the graphic at the bottom, we have our income ventiles, and the colors represent, the blue color represents high-speed rail, the red other long-distance rail, and the gray short-distance rail. And if we look at the different ratios, the Palmer ratio takes the ratio of the top 10% over the bottom 40%. The argument that he uses is that in between, there's not much difference across income groups. So where we get the greatest difference is between the top 10% income earners and the bottom 40%. The 5-5 ratio is the ventiles. That's the top 5 versus the bottom 5 in 2020, top 20 versus bottom 20, 10-10, top 10 versus the bottom. But overall, we have something in high-speed rail about the ratio of the highest over the lowest is somewhere between, depending on which measure you use, somewhere between 8 and 10. It's less for long distance rail, somewhere around 5 or 6, and for short distance rail, 3 to 4. So there does seem to be some evidence here that's suggesting that high-speed rail in GB in Great Britain is very much more emphasizing travel for those people within the highest income groups. We look at air travel, and we have the same sort of graphic here. We have our 20 different income groups, and what we find within that, and ratios that are similar, but maybe slightly less than those that we had before, so more in this sort of area rather than the right-hand side of that. And so between 5 and 7 or something of that order, depending on what measure we use, in terms of the ratios between the lower incomes and the highest incomes. But there has been, until recently again, huge increases in air travel, and international mobility has been one of the major growth areas. But if we just look at the averages, it does give rather a partial view. So we also looked at the data from the UK airports, the major UK airports, and we find that over the same sort of period and up to more recently, about half the population, 53%, had not flown within the last 12 months. So about half the UK population would take one return trip each year. It won't necessarily be the same 50% over time, but its proportions are roughly the same. And interestingly, with the advent of low-cost operators and things, this level has remained stable over the last 15 years. It hasn't really changed very much. So of those that had flown, 20% just made one flight, 11% two, 6% three, and 10% more than three. Now, I would realize that in Canada or the USA or in some other larger countries, that these numbers are very, very small compared with the amounts of flights that you might make. But in the UK, and these figures have been corroborated by our Climate Change Committee, suggests that about 10% of the population make 60% of all the flights. And this is not a picture here that was taken recently at a UK airport. This is taken about a year ago at a UK airport. So the inequality argument here is quite an interesting one, or I feel it is. And there is what is called a double injustice. The poor contribute less to consumption and to climate change, but they're also more likely or most likely to be impacted by the negative effects. And some would say there's a triple injustice, as they don't have the means, the knowledge, the resources to seek any recompense. So I think this is quite both an interesting and important statement to make. So what we've been saying is that the poor use less transport, they travel shorter distances, they're more likely to use public transport, so they contribute less to the problems. But they also tend to live in areas like under flight paths to airports and things where they're impacted by the negative effects of other people traveling. And also they don't have the necessary, as I was saying, knowledge or expertise to actually seek some form of redress from that. And I've worked with Ian Goff on this issue in another context. And if subject to recent events, if the increase in long distance air travel continues or was likely to continue, then aviation could account for about 22% of global CO2 emissions by 2050. This is partly because other sectors would be reducing their CO2 imprint, but partly because aviation would be increasing its footprint. So the less of one and the more of the other means that it's making a much greater contribution to CO2, global CO2. So those are some sort of evidence, I suppose, with respect to what's happening or what's been happening in the UK over the that 10-year period. Then quite a large part of what I've been thinking about and working on is the non-income aspects of this. And income is only one important factor in this, and we could cut the information in many different ways, but we haven't done that in this particular book. But what we have looked at is looking at three other interesting approaches. One which is just beginning, well, two I suppose, which are just beginning to be applied within the transport sector, and one which is commonly in use, accessibility. Notions of well-being, and this leans heavily on, and on the work of Amartya Sen, is talking about what people do and what people value. So it's their ability to achieve what he calls valued functioning, and the activities that people engage with, but also the opportunities, the freedoms and the satisfactions with these activities, the capabilities, as he calls them, that are available. Now, there's a huge literature around this, but and I know some people have been working on trying to operationalize this within the transport context, but it's really difficult to do so because it relates to individuals. And a lot of what we do in transport, we like to think we talk about individuals, but we don't. We talk about bigger groups of people rather than individuals. In the transport sector, the concept of motility is another one, which I think has some scope. It's the work primarily of Vincent Kaufman and some of his colleagues. And it talks more about not just mobility, but the ability to organize what one does, one's everyday life. And it includes things like access rights to opportunities, individual competencies, which relate to people's knowledge, skills, and general ability, and also an evaluative concept, the evaluation of its suitability. And this, I think, is quite important because sometimes people use what these are called eudaimonic approaches to analysis as what is important to the individual. But again, it suffers from the problem of operationalization in the sense that each individual is rather different and their motility is rather different to even people within their own family or within their own locality. And then thirdly, there's the accessibility, which is most widely used, but I think we should be aware of and accept its limitations. Accessibility primarily looks at thresholds or travel time reduction, and it treats time as a commodity, so it's something that is tradable. It's not a resource in the true sense. And there are very limited concerns over destination suitability, and it doesn't explicitly look at distribution. It can do, but it's quite difficult to do that. But this does have the advantage, it is commonly used, and it is something that we can apply in a much wider context than the other two notions that we've talked about. Accessibility is, I suppose, embedded within the more traditional transport planning, the rationality paradigm, and it does tell part of the story, but perhaps not all of the story. So we cover a lot of this, and there are examples there, and we also look in this section of the book at issues relating more broadly to sustainability and the environment. As we've said, the poor has less impact on the environment and are impacted by other people's activities and could be seen as being at greater risk. And there's a conflict here within the context of sustainability about the need to reduce the impact of all people on the planet and use of resources. But it might be, or maybe it ought to be targeted more at those people that have a bigger footprint, i.e. the rich, than those that are less well off. And I would suggest, if you're interested in these issues, is to look at Motility and her colleagues' work on this, and where they conclude that the richest 10% of the households produce about 3 times as much CO2 as the poorest 10%. But when we look at road transport, the difference is much greater, and if we're looking at aviation, it is even more so. I think that's worth thinking about as well. We also looked at the indirect effects of and the impact on the poor, and we looked at issues relating to location, where new development is located, whether there is public transport accessibility or other forms of movement provision, cycle paths and the like embedded within that development, looking at closures such as libraries, schools, hospitals, where facilities are being concentrated and the costs are transferred from the providers of the service to the users of the service, and this may in itself lead to inequality. And then there are the sort of the health risks, people being exposed to pollution created by others, being exposed to a higher probability of being involved in crashes, and the difficulties that they have in terms that they haven't got the flexibility to move home or anything like that. The data here is very difficult. There are a number of studies, some in North America, that have been carried out on this. And we also looked at the different forms of subsidy to different types of transport, aviation, rail, and motoring, which all have extensive subsidies, which again help those that are most mobile, maybe the rich, and the subsidies to the buses that are perhaps provided more for those that don't have access to the car or have the ability to drive the car. But I think the indirect effects is that's not necessarily what people do in terms of travel, but it's the impact that others have or other decisions that are made on their well-being. So in terms of conclusions, there are sort of three broad areas that I think that it's really important to begin to think about what we ought to be doing. Transport policy is the first sort of broader area, that how can we better address issues related to social well-being? It's not just what people do, i.e. the travel which they take part in, but it must also cover their experiences, what Sen calls their capabilities, but have this feedback loop that we were talking about with respect to motility in terms of whether they have a positive experience or a negative experience about it. This is where you're getting towards the notion of well-being. So what we suggest, or what I suggest in the book, is that the distributional effect should be made much more explicit. Perhaps a new paradigm, I don't know. We're not that far down the road. But we need to sort of look at a much wider interpretation of growth, particularly in terms of things like GDP type indicators and other measures of primarily economic growth. But we need to incorporate, broaden that to include notions of social well-being. We also need to look at issues relating to how we can, within the context of sustainability, use less non-renewable resources. How can we be more efficient in terms of using renewable resources and being less dependent on non-renewable resources? Can we direct public investment and subsidy more specifically at those who are perceived to be disadvantaged? And the debate about, to address what I started off with, the aspirations of people about their mobility, about their lifestyles, about their quality of life, how can we enter into a debate with them to raise the quality of that debate, but also raise human capital more generally, so that we can consider all the interests within society. I mean, and I put an illustration here, for instance, on the rail subsidies. In the UK, rail subsidies account for 45% of public expenditure, 55% goes to the bus industry. On average, every household receives a subsidy of £151, but the richest receive more than twice as much as the poorest, mainly because they make much more use, particularly of the rail system, which is more heavily subsidized, and they travel much further. Okay, this is where we are at the moment. Is this where we want to be going forward in the future? Or are there ways in which we can redress that and reorientate the subsidies that we have more towards those that might actually need those? Secondly, for transport planning, measurement and data, I put this in because the more I think about this and the more I try and find ways of looking at the Amartya Sen type arguments, is that one feels that the search for quantification is maybe misplaced. We should be more mature in the sense of trying to get a much better, much more detailed, and much more nuanced discussion about issues relating to fairness and inequality. So it's not just the measures of inequality that I talked about. We should be discussing how we can approach both that measurement, the sorts of data that we might be needing to support that, and the arguments that we can bring to bear. Secondly, on investment and cost-benefit analysis, this tends to favor large-scale projects, not local transport. And this has been reflected as well to some extent in international travel and distance that people travel. If we are concerned about sustainable development, we have a moral responsibility to consume less. So should we be invested in large-scale projects which may help the rich travel further and faster, rather than sort of thinking of this the other way around and say which projects actually contribute to sustainable development. Thirdly, subsidy and fairness. How can we better target these strategies, reducing inequality and also encouraging innovation? I see the two going together, that there are ways in which we can make transport and other forms of movement, make forms of movement more equitable through innovation, but it's being able to ensure that those that really need them have access to them, rather than not being able to afford them or not having the knowledge to use them. The double injustice I've mentioned is also important, because people have a right to live a clean, healthy, safe, secure life within a quiet local environment. And I think, again, this is something that is talked about, but it's not easy, but it's talked about, but we don't do very much about trying to think about policies that are going to allow that to happen. I think in some European cities that has really now begun to become one of the main tenets of the urban fabric, and as a result of recent events, COVID events, this may also be more widely seen as a way in which one can ensure this sort of set of rights that people, those in poorer quality neighborhoods, can benefit from improvements in their quality of life. And finally here, the ethics. Decision-making is not independent or impartial. People are not treated equally. The utilitarian, the rationality favors the rich, the status quo in terms of their values are deemed to be more valuable than others. We need a more normative value system, and when we need some sort of debate over that in terms of making sure that those people don't disappear, the people who I've been trying to talk about. And finally here for public policy, 4 key messages. I think the way forward is to look at means by which we can prioritize investment and subsidy to meet the needs of the disadvantaged. We first need to identify those needs, and then we need to find ways of meeting them. So this is suggesting a rather different way to current decision making in public policy, which is led primarily by a fairly sort of mechanistic approach to cost-benefit analysis that doesn't include explicit distributional dimensions. So we need to know who the winners and losers from decisions are when we're allocating public funds. And we don't need to talk about compensation and that sort of thing. We need to be much more explicit and look at ways of targeting those that are less well off. We need, again, to look at ways of protecting the rights of all people. I mentioned this in the previous slide, to live in a high quality local environment. And I think transport is rather different to other sectors within the economy, in that it provides this sort of glue, the linkages between that. The connectivity is hugely important, and recently, obviously, that connectivity is being broken and meetings are held like this, but it's a means we need to have face-to-face contact to actually look at ways in which we can raise human capital. And transport is an essential part of that mechanism to allow that face-to-face connectivity to actually take place. So it seems to me that in the recent past, in this country, with privatization and deregulation of services and the provision of infrastructure, that there has been a change in the sense that the public sector has become a facilitator of the big project, whether it's a transport project, a housing project, or a development project, and they've lost that social policy, lost that social dimension. So the public sector has become more of an extension of the private sector, and this means that the voice of the poor or disadvantaged people has not been heard. So my conclusion then would be that these are the sorts of questions that we should be asking of decision makers and researching. These are the sorts of questions that ought to be much higher on the list of public priorities. And with that, I will end the presentation. But as I said, please go to the website, which is hopefully visible at the bottom here, www.inequalityintransport.org.uk, which tells you about this book, which as I said is self-published. So I don't have the backup from Routledge or Elgar. As well as being the author, I am the promotions, the marketing manager, and everything else of it. And I hope that you have found something of interest in this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. There's a lot to digest and from what you told, and the book is amazing and inspiring in many ways. And every time I read it, I feel there's something new, a new angle to how we look at equity and and make us all think. So thank you so much. We have a big list of questions that came 2 pages. So Jenny will pick some of the general ones first, and some of the current issues. I'll start with the one, there was one about COVID, which I think it came from Manuela Pereira. Do you think that the current COVID pandemic can potentially exacerbate inequalities in terms of mobility and accessibility?
Yeah, unfortunately, I feel, yes, that this is affecting all of us, but I think disproportionately those that are in the sorts of groups, the bottom, say, 10% of the income, and this is partly an issue that relates more widely to social policy, to housing, to living in cramped to not having the resources in terms of being able to get out and purchase to buy food and that sort of thing. But also that they are probably as well exposed, or more likely to be exposed, as they're living in close proximity within their own family unit, and also in many cities in the world that it is really difficult to get around if one is trying to get around without having contact. So although in many ways I see there are opportunities within COVID to actually, as a result, to actually change things, to rethink things, and this may be a good opportunity to put inequality higher up that agenda. Most of the things that are being discussed are related to the trying to get the economy back working again, possibly trying to re-establish re-establish ways in which people are prepared to go out more, to mix more, to socialize and that sort of thing. But I think there are 2 big issues that are problematic with COVID, and I'd be interested in other people's experiences on this as well. One is the issue of social distancing. If we're going to have to social distance for a year or 2 years or something like that, how is that going to actually work? And I think that, the science there is unclear, but if this is going to, how are our cities going to actually operate in the future if we're going to try and follow that as well as we can? And Secondly, I think is the question of, in the UK, the advice has been not to use public transport because the risk involved if you're using public transport is higher than if you're in your own car. Yet much of the debate in the previous 10, 20 years has been trying to get more people to use public transport rather than less people to use public transport. How do you change that discourse so that people are prepared to get back and go back onto public transport again? And this is likely, particularly people users of buses where limits have been put on numbers and things, it's likely to affect those in the lower income groups, the people who are less well off, in terms that they don't have a choice.
That's an informative answer. But it raises more questions, actually, and it makes us think. Abdulrahman Hamid, he asked, do you think inequalities in transportation is lower in developing countries, based on your readings and your studies, since the majority trips are made by the lower income groups?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think the inequality?
I think probably, and again, we looked a little bit at this in Manila in the Philippines a couple of years ago. Well, sorry, about 3 or 4 years ago now, and I think the answer is yes, but the answer is also no. The general answer is yes, in the sense that it is probably lower in developing countries, but the extremes can be much higher, that the differences between the very high income groups and the very low income groups can be much higher. So I was talking about ratios of maybe 5 to 7 times between the top income group and the bottom. In developing countries, it might be an order of magnitude twice as much as that, although obviously from perhaps a lower starting point. But also, I think the difficulty with the developing countries is other means by which they can follow a different pathway. Do they have to follow the same pathway that, say, Canada has, or the UK has, or the US has, where we go through a period of mass car ownership and things, and at the end of that, we begin to think about, well, what do we do next, sort of thing? Can we look at ways in which they can, as it were, technology jump or something to move beyond that, to looking at ways in which public transport, ways in which small, efficient electric vehicles, say, in city centres can be introduced. And remember, in many developing countries, space is even more restricted than it is in many developed countries. So, and the street space is a shared space, and much more of a shared space rather than an exclusive space. So we again have real difficulties in terms of thinking of a strategy that would permit the lower income countries, as they develop, to, in a sense, begin to show the richer countries what can be done in that situation. But unfortunately, it does also seem that there is a tendency to follow in the footsteps of the richer countries.
There's a lot of questions that seem to revolve around alternative ways of thinking about evaluating equity. So many questions people start to ask, to what extent has your work that you have done that looked at other possibilities? You showed us a lot about high income and low income when it comes to gender, race, age, rural, urban versus rural, things like that. To what extent did you jump deep in these areas, the inequalities?
I think the short answer is not very much. That's partly data issues, that some of the variables of interest aren't collected. This is the data we've used is the national, as I said, National Travel Survey. And it's the biggest database available in the UK, and it's the biggest database that's that has a continuous time span for this period of time, although more recently it's changed a little bit, which makes comparisons harder. We could do quite a lot, but we didn't, mainly because other people have done that sort of disaggregation by age, by sex, by age, by gender. Race is a little bit harder. The data isn't very good on that. On disability, there's information on that. And also, what would be interesting is looking at it by housing and other things, but that again is a much harder way forward. So I think there are different ways of looking at it, and the work we've done, I mean, the reason we concentrated on income, I suppose, is that it was available, and we were able to get these special tabulations from the travel survey, but also that sort of thing in the UK certainly hadn't been done before. I mean, there are problems with the data, with the income data. It's not complete, and there are various issues relating to the accuracy of it. But with the sample size that we had, I think we're reasonably confident about the sorts of patterns that were emerging. But I think that whether one cuts it in a variety of different ways, one soon, even with a large data set, gets to quite a small data set. And one thing we would like to have done, for instance, was to look at it on a regional basis or even a citywide basis. But even the database with 4 million trips in it doesn't allow us to do very much work in that respect. We soon come down to lots of empty cells, and rather it becomes rather difficult, I think, to be able to come to any sort of firm conclusions. So there are problems with that, but I do think that we need to be thinking much more in a variety of different ways about how do we develop distribution analysis? How do we actually look at the distribution? So we're not just looking at average values. We're looking at the shape of the curve, and we're looking at what happens in different parts of that curve, whether that curve is related to income, related to age, related to housing condition, related to employment, which we did look at in quite a lot of detail. Different types of employment is important, and that would obviously increase our understanding of these issues in a more multidimensional way.
I'll go to a couple of questions going into the details of the analysis you showed us when it comes to the travel patterns. And some questions were taken around, one by Chris Bruce, around trying to understand the differences between the poor and the rich. And what's your thought is the contributing between that differences that we saw, the purpose that of what's the most contributor to this big differences we are seeing, that the rich are traveling longer, they are taking advantage of the system more. So what do you think? Is it like discretionary travels? Is what's causing that in the patterns? Or is it?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting issue. I mean with aviation, for instance. I mean, I think there. I don't know about in your own countries, but here, much of the debate it comes from the aviation industry about the importance of aviation to the economy. But about 20% of all trips, air trips, are business-related trips, and that's roughly constant. Growth in the market is coming from leisure trips and visiting friends and relatives and people's extended network, because as people say, more people go to university and things, they get much more internationalized and eventually would like to go and visit some of their friends overseas and that sort of thing. So there's a whole dynamic that is evolving there. And what that question sort of sparks in my mind is that there may be groups within the poor category that are, in a sense, I don't know, more content with their situation than other people within that category, in the sense that they live quite localized lifestyles, their families live nearby, They can get to the local shops and local schools and everything else, so they don't need a huge international network. And then at the other extreme, there are people who have all sorts of international networks. But the people at the high level need to have the resources to do that. Those at the poor level, some may be content, maybe even be happy, but there are many others perhaps that would like to do things in a rather different way. I think the only way to actually really understand what's going on there would be to say, do some sort of targeted survey in particular areas and talk to people, or develop a panel survey or something like that, which would begin to unpack what is actually going on here. I mean, all we have is numbers. We don't have any, there's no qualitative material that can supplement the material that we have. And obviously all the material we have is anonymized. And so we can't find a way of going back and talking to the people. But I think one would need to do different type of empirical research to actually be able to unpack that interesting issue.
I wish we had more time. I'll ask one more question. We'll go a little bit over time, but I'll ask last question, because it's an interesting one coming from Matthew Conway and he was asking about, like, when you go back to your figure, you see a little bit higher tick in the very low income groups for high-speed rail compared to the next quartiles or the size that you were showing in the figure. Do you have any idea why?
Yeah.
You observed that.
This worried us to begin with, but I mean, and this, people have suggested that one, perhaps even if you have the data, you shouldn't look at ventiles, that you should be looking at deciles, so you aggregate that up. But in that group, in the lowest group, there are people who are on sort of fixed incomes, people who are retired and that sort of thing. Some of those may be more mobile than others. But you also, within that group, you're quite likely to have some sort of travel concession, and you may be making use of that. So they may, have half-price travel or half-price rail travel or something like that, which may generate. So I think there are explanations for that. One relating to the fixed income issue, the other relating to maybe they're taking advantage of some sort of concession or something like that. But again, to really unpack that, one would need to go and talk to those people. I think it's not uncommon across any sort of analysis that's carried out related to income that there is this anomalous group at the bottom end that seems to be doing things that one wouldn't expect them necessarily to do because of various sort of special circumstances and things. I mean, for instance, I found quite interesting was that low-income groups make quite a lot of use of taxis. And I was talking to various people about this. We had a sort of various group discussion sessions, and they were saying that these were poor people. They were saying that they would take a taxi one way, but not take a taxi the other way. So if they were going shopping, they would take the taxi back from the shop to the home because they're carrying shopping. They would take public transport there. And if they were going to a doctor's surgery or something, or to a medical appointment or something, they would take the taxi there to get there on time, but they might then get public transport back home again. So you're getting sort of things that in one sense would be counterintuitive, but if one goes and tries to unpack it with some of these people, you might get what seems to be a quite logical explanation for it.
Thank you so much, David, Professor Banister. It's a pleasure to have you here today with us, and we have to wrap it up. And I'd like to thank you and remind everybody we have a series of another 12 seminars there, and you can register on the website if you're interested in attending. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. We have a lot of questions. We're going to send them to you after the talk. and a lot of good ideas. Some
Well, I hope
over
that some of
many
you, I hope
others.
that some of you actually will get your libraries to purchase a copy of the book.
Yeah, we have copies, I think.
Yeah, well,
I'm sure,
more copies the better.
Yeah,
And for me.
like I have, as I said earlier when I was introducing you, my students are sending copies to their parents to read. So this is how famous it is among the planning students.
Yeah, I mean, Christmas is coming up. Now, what better stocking filler could you have?
Thank you so much, David. It was a pleasure to see you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.